Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to discuss the latest spectacular misinformation about sea level. Science alert! Sea levels around the U.S. aren't just rising, they're accelerating year on year. The worst-case scenario for sea level rise in the United States is more than just a dim possibility. It's becoming more likely. An annual report card for the U.S. coastline shows sea levels are speeding up in most places measured. Acceleration can be a game changer in terms of impacts and planning, so we really need to pay heed to these patterns, says John Boone at William & Mary's Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Out of the 32 tidal stations monitored from Maine to Alaska, the team detected sea level rise in no less than 27. What's more, 25 of those locations experienced higher rates of sea level rise in 2019 than in the year before. The Gulf Coast in Louisiana and Galveston and Rockport in Texas were at the very top of the list. In fact, Rockport trumped all 32 stations, exhibiting a rate of sea level rise that the authors say would ultimately leave water levels 0.82 meters higher in 2050 than in 1992. We're going to look at these claims, but first I want to cover some of the basics of sea level. Tide gauges measure the movement of the sea surface relative to the land surface. An apparent rise in sea level from a tide gauge can mean that the ocean's surface is rising. It can also mean that the land is sinking, or it could mean that both are happening at the same time. One problem with tide gauges is that over time, gravity tends to pull them down into the ground, creating the impression of sea level rise which isn't actually occurring. Another problem is tides and waves. Sea level varies by a huge amount from hour to hour and minute to minute. Tide gauges attempt to measure a fraction of a millimeter of sea level rise in an environment where the sea surface height is changing several orders of magnitude more than that every minute. This is a very difficult problem, and it's one of the reasons why there's so many incompetent sea level rise studies being done. The next principle which I'm going to discuss is that water seeks a level surface. This is a pond near my house seen on a very calm day. The surface of the lake is very flat, and you can see spectacular reflections of the clouds and sky. If water is added at one end of the pond, the water level has to rise by an equal amount every place else in the pond. You can't have mounds of water pile up at one end of the pond. The same thing is true in the ocean. If water is added to the oceans, sea level will rise everywhere. The reason that different tide gauges show different rates of sea level rise is because they're not actually measuring sea level. What they're doing is they're measuring sea level relative to the elevation of the tide gauge, but the elevation of the tide gauge can change. Thus, we see different rates of sea level rise or fall at different tide gauges around the world. The next very important fact is that sea level has been rising for 20,000 years. Sea level was very low 20,000 years ago. It was so low that people were able to walk across the Bering Strait from Siberia to Alaska. But over the last 20,000 years, sea level has risen 120 meters or 400 feet. Almost all of this sea level rise occurred more than 6,000 years ago. Over the past 6,000 years, sea level rise rates have been very low. This BBC article from the year 2002 discussed a drowned ancient city which was now under 120 feet of water. The city was probably about 9,000 years old, and it's unlikely that a carbon tax would have saved them. Now let's go back to the article and look at their discussion of sea level rise rates along the Gulf Coast. They said the Gulf Coast in Louisiana and Galveston and Rockport in Texas were at the very top of the list. But even the Washington Post knows that the apparent sea level rise along the Gulf Coast is due to the land sinking rather than the oceans rising. Here's a Washington Post article from 3 years ago. It's common knowledge that the coast of Louisiana is quietly sinking into the balmy Gulf waters. But new research suggests we may have been underestimating how quickly it's happening. The new map suggests that on average the Louisiana coast is sinking at a rate of about 9 millimeters per year. Now let's look at the NOAA Sea Level Trends map. These red dots show that sea level along the Louisiana coast is rising about 9 to 12 millimeters per year. Remember that the land is sinking at 9 millimeters per year. What this tells us is that all or almost all of the sea level rise rate seen along the Louisiana coast is due to the land sinking rather than the oceans rising. The primary cause of the land sinking is that we put up levees along the Mississippi River. The land there used to be replenished by silt coming down the Mississippi River in floods, but that doesn't happen anymore. Another problem they have along the Gulf Coast is that they've pumped water and oil out of the ground, which causes the land to subside. So the apparent sea level rise along the Gulf Coast has nothing to do with climate and everything to do with other human activities. The article says that they measured sea level from Alaska around the United States up into New England. And now we're going to do the same thing. Sea level in Alaska has been plummeting for as long as records have been kept. This is not because sea level is falling, it's because the land in Alaska is rising. The long-term trend is linear, it's a straight line. This tells us that the rate of sea level rise is not changing. If sea level rise rates were increasing, as the article claimed, we would see an upwards curvature in this graph. But there is no upwards curvature. The graph shows a straight line. Now we're going to travel down the west coast to Seattle, Washington. The tide gauge at Seattle shows a steady linear rate of sea level rise since the year 1900. Once again, there is no upwards curvature and no indication that sea level rise rates are accelerating. In Oregon, there's been essentially no trend over the past century, and once again, no acceleration, no upwards curvature. In Northern California, apparent sea level is falling very slightly, and no upwards curvature. In the San Francisco Bay, there's been a very slight rise in sea level over the last 80 years, but no upwards curvature, no indication of an acceleration. In Southern California at La Jolla, it's the same story. There's no indication that sea level rise rates have accelerated. This animation shows high tide at La Jolla in 1871 transitioning into a recent high tide picture. As you can see, sea level at La Jolla, California has hardly changed over the last 150 years. Now let's go down to Texas. Sea level at Galveston has been rising very quickly. And as the Washington Post article discussed, this is due to the land sinking. But once again, note there is no upwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise rates have not accelerated. And it's the same story in Louisiana. The land is sinking very quickly, but there's no indication of an acceleration. There's no upwards curvature. Sea level in Florida is rising slightly, but the trend is linear. There's no indication of an acceleration. Same story at Wilmington, North Carolina. At first glance, it appears that there's been a recent acceleration, but you can see that the same thing occurred around the year 1940. There can be a tremendous amount of year-over-year variability in sea level. This can be due to changes in wind patterns, changes in atmospheric pressure, or changes in ocean temperature. But the bottom line is that the long-term trend is flat. There's no indication of an acceleration in sea level rise. It's the same story at Baltimore, Maryland, the same story at Atlantic City, New Jersey, and the same story at Lower Manhattan, where sea level is rising at the same rate now as it was when Abraham Lincoln was president. In 1988, NASA's James Hansen started the global warming scare before Congress, and he also predicted in 1988 that Lower Manhattan would be underwater within 30 years. If Hansen were correct, Wall Street would have been drowned 2 years ago. But the stock market is currently doing just fine and at record highs. This graph shows the long-term rate of sea level rise at Lower Manhattan. You can see that sea level rise rates at Lower Manhattan peaked around the year 1950. Not exactly a climate crisis. Let's look at one last tide gauge in New England. Sea level at Boston has been rising linearly over the past century, and there's no indication of an acceleration. There's no upwards curvature. Note that there's a tremendous amount of year-over-year variability. Sea level can change by as much as a foot over just a few years. But then the sea level goes back down again, which is why we look at the long-term trend rather than year-over-year variability. Now let's go back to the original paper. They determined that sea level rise rates were accelerating because they said the rate of rise in 2019 was higher than it was in 2018. But you can't evaluate sea level based on a single year. There's a huge amount of year-over-year variability. If you looked at very short-term behavior in Alaska, you could convince yourself that sea level is rising, when in fact it's actually falling very quickly. The claims being made in this paper are meaningless propaganda. Sea level has been rising for 20,000 years. It has nothing to do with climate change. And there's no indication that sea level rise rates are accelerating. We see garbage like this all the time, pretty much every single day. So how does it get published? The reason is because the press refuses to talk to anybody who tells the truth about climate. They say climate change is real, we must not offer credibility to those who deny it. They behave just like a faith-based religious cult. They use words like belief and denial, which is the language of religion, not science. So what they do is they give their ear to anyone who's willing to make alarmist statements about climate while censoring anyone who tells the truth. The press corps, who are supposed to be the bastions of free speech, have become its very enemies. In 1988, the United Nations predicted that the Maldives would be underwater within 30 years, which would have been 2 years ago. And this is what the Maldives looked like earlier today. They don't appear to be underwater. However, in 1837, which was Victoria's first year as queen, there actually were islands in the Maldives sinking into the ocean. And geologists have discovered that coral atolls in the Pacific Ocean are actually growing rather than shrinking, as alarmists claim. 1,000 years ago, King Canute took his subjects down to the sea to show them that government does not control sea level. It's unfortunate that journalists and politicians are not as clever now as they were 1,000 years ago. The press gives climate alarmists a blank check to tell as big a lie as they want to tell. And they will never allow anyone to set the record straight, which is why Toto has to set the record straight about junk science and propaganda. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's very important that we get the word out about climate fraud in this critical election year.